There is a piece of land in Harlan County, Kentucky, that the county government tried to sell for 11 years. 11 years. They listed it 4 times at auction. 4 times, the bidders walked the perimeter, looked at the rock shelves jutting through the thin soil, looked at the impenetrable mat of briars and invasive shrub, looked at the erosion channels cutting through what little topsoil remained, and left. Not a single serious offer. The county dropped the price each time, from $42,000 to $30,000 to $18,000 to $9,000. $9,000 for 90 acres. $100 per acre. The kind of price that should have had buyers lining up at the courthouse door. Nobody lined up, because everyone who looked at those 90 acres reached the same conclusion that every soil scientist, every agricultural extension officer, and every farmer within 20 miles had already reached. That land was done. It had been overgrazed to nothing by 2 previous owners over 40 years. The topsoil that hadn't been compacted had washed into the creek below. The pasture grass had been replaced by eastern red cedar, multiflora rose, and a thick, aggressive mat of autumn olive that made the whole property look, from the county road, like a green wall of useless thorns. Rocky, eroded, overgrown. The county wrote it off. And then, in the spring of 2014, a woman named Louise Bright drove to the Harlan County Courthouse, sat down in the auction room, and bought those 90 acres for $8,500. The room was almost empty. The county clerk, who had processed 3 previous failed auctions for this exact property, looked up from her paperwork when Louise's hand went up. She looked at Louise for a moment. Then she looked back at her paperwork and wrote down the number. What she did not write down, what nobody in that room recorded or measured or understood that morning, was the reason Louise Bright raised her hand. And that reason is the whole story. If you enjoy watching ordinary people do extraordinary things with the land everyone else walked away from, this is the channel for you. Subscribe to the Rural Files. We tell the stories that don't make the evening news but deserve to. And drop your state or country in the comments. We love knowing where this reaches. Louise Bright was 51 years old when she bought the property. She was not a farmer by training. She was a retired high school biology teacher from a small town in eastern Kentucky who had spent 27 years teaching students about ecosystems, nutrient cycles, and the science of how living things interact with their environment. She had grown up watching her father run a small cattle operation on the adjacent valley floor. The good land, the flat land, the land that didn't argue with you. She had helped with the cattle as a girl. She understood the basic rhythms of farming, but she had never farmed herself. Her husband Thomas had died 3 years before the auction. He had left her a modest house on 4 acres and a pension that covered her costs, without leaving much room for anything extra. When her students, now grown, now with children of their own, heard that she had spent $8,500 on 90 acres of county-rejected scrubland, several of them called to check on her. One of them, a former student named Marcus who had gone on to become an agricultural extension officer for a neighboring county, drove out to the property with her in May of 2014. He walked the perimeter. He tested the soil in 3 locations. He looked at the rock density across the upper fields. He measured the erosion depth in the worst channels. Then he sat on the hood of his truck at the edge of the property and told her what he found. The soil pH was acidic and depleted. The organic matter content was under 2%. A working pasture typically needs 5 or 6. The compaction from decades of overgrazing meant that rainfall was running off the surface rather than soaking in, which was accelerating the erosion and preventing any vegetation from establishing properly. The rock density on the upper 40 acres made conventional tillage impossible. You couldn't bring a tractor across most of that terrain without risking the equipment. And the invasive species coverage, the autumn olive, the multiflora rose, the cedar, was so complete that any grass seed you broadcast would simply fail to establish beneath the existing canopy. Marcus told her all of this carefully and professionally. Then he said, "Miss Bright, I'm not sure what you're planning, but whatever it is, I want you to know what you're working with." She thanked him. She asked him one question. "Is the bedrock structurally sound across the upper section?" He said yes. The rock was sound. The problem was the surface, not the foundation. She nodded once. She said, "Good. That's what I needed to know." Marcus drove away that afternoon, genuinely uncertain whether his former biology teacher had made the mistake of her retirement or the smartest investment in the county. The neighbors were less charitable in their assessment. The farm directly south of Louise's property was run by a man named Dale Puckett, 62 years old, third-generation farmer, a man whose father had been one of the previous owners who had overgrazed the land into its current state before selling it to the county to avoid the back taxes. Dale knew this land. He had grown up watching it. He had watched his father work it too hard for too many years. He had watched the grass give up. He had watched the briars move in. He had watched the county try and fail to sell it 4 times. When he heard Louise Bright had bought it, he drove to the fence line and looked across the property and shook his head slowly with the expression of a man watching someone make a mistake in slow motion. He said to no one in particular, "She's going to lose that money." His wife agreed. The feed store in town agreed. The county agricultural board declined to comment officially, but their unofficial opinion was visible in the fact that they never called Louise to offer resources or assistance in her first year. Nobody expected her to succeed. Nobody expected her to still be trying by the time 18 months had passed. What nobody knew, what Louise had not yet told anyone, including Marcus, was that she had been planning this for 9 years, since before Thomas died, since before the property was even listed for the second time, since a trip she had taken to a regenerative agriculture conference in Tennessee in 2005, where she had sat in a breakout session that changed the way she thought about damaged land forever. The session was presented by a rancher from Hill Country, Texas, named Gerald Farr, who had spent 12 years restoring 240 acres of heavily degraded cedar-invaded ranchland, using a method he had developed through trial and error, and an enormous amount of reading, and an animal that most serious livestock producers in that part of the country considered a hobby animal at best. Goats, not cattle, not sheep, not machinery. Goats, specifically, meat goats, a mix of Boer and Spanish breeds with the foraging instinct, the climbing ability, and the browsing preference that makes them fundamentally different from every other livestock animal in how they interact with the landscape. Goats do not graze. This is the distinction that most people who have never kept goats do not understand. Cattle graze. They move across grass and eat from the ground up. Sheep graze. Same principle, lower selectivity. Goats browse. They eat from the ground up, yes, but they also eat from the shrub level. They will stand on their hind legs to reach the lower branches of small trees. They will push through thorny undergrowth that would stop a cow dead in her tracks. They are not deterred by the thorns of multiflora rose or the bitter leaves of autumn olive. They eat both. More importantly, on rocky, uneven terrain that would twist the ankle of a beef cow and make a conventional tractor utterly useless, goats are completely at home. They have evolved for exactly this landscape. Gerald Farr had understood this and had used it. Louise Bright had understood it too. She ordered her first animals in the autumn of 2014. 24 boar does, 6 Spanish cross wethers, and 2 boar bucks. 32 goats for 90 acres. She built a basic perimeter fence with woven wire and T-posts. Not electrified, not expensive, just solid enough to keep the goats from wandering onto Dale Puckett's good pasture next door. She constructed a simple 3-sided shelter from treated lumber in the only flat section of the upper field. And in November of 2014, she opened the gate and let 32 goats onto 90 acres of the worst land in Harlan County. They disappeared into the brush within 40 minutes. This was not the problem it would have been with cattle. It was, in fact, exactly what she needed. A goat's natural browsing instinct takes them into dense vegetation rather than away from it. Where a beef cow would stand at the edge of a briar patch and refuse, a goat reads the same briar patch as a buffet. Over the following weeks, Louise tracked her herd across the property using the simple method of following the sound of brush being disturbed and the visible paths the goats were cutting through the autumn olive. The autumn olive, an invasive shrub introduced to the U.S. in the 1950s as an ornamental and for erosion control, now considered a serious agricultural pest in the eastern United States, was Louise's primary target. It fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere into the soil, which sounds beneficial, but actually creates a nitrogen surplus that allows autumn olive itself to outcompete native vegetation. It produces seeds prolifically, and birds spread them widely. Once established, it is nearly impossible to eradicate by mechanical means without also destroying the topsoil you are trying to protect. But goats will eat it, not just the leaves, the bark, the stems, the root crowns if you give them enough time and enough return visits. They do not eliminate it in one pass, but they weaken it. They set it back. They consume the energy it would have put into seed production. Louise divided her 90 acres into 6 rotational paddocks, using temporary electrified polywire, the lightest, cheapest way to manage goat movement across rough terrain. She moved the herd from paddock to paddock on a roughly 8-week cycle, giving each section time to recover between grazing periods. This is the principle at the heart of regenerative grazing, that land damaged by overgrazing is not healed by removing all animals, but by introducing animals in the right number, for the right duration, with the right rest period between visits. The previous owners had overgrazed because they kept too many cattle on the land for too long with no rotation. The cattle had eaten everything: the grass, the forb, the seedling trees, leaving the land with nothing to hold the soil in place. Louise was not going to repeat that mistake. She was going to do the opposite. The first winter was quiet. The goats stayed in the most heavily brushed areas by preference, which suited Louise perfectly because the upper 40 acres was where the brush was thickest and the rock was closest to the surface. By spring of 2015, 6 months in, the first visible change appeared. Not green grass, not recovered pasture, something smaller than that. Something you had to know to look for. Light. The upper field, which had been so thoroughly covered by autumn olive and cedar canopy that the ground beneath it sat in permanent shade year-round. That field was beginning to let light reach the soil surface in patches 3 to 6 feet wide, where the goats had worked the hardest. Louise noticed it on a morning in March when she was checking water troughs on the upper paddock. She stopped. She looked at the ground in one of those light patches. There was something there, fine, pale, barely visible against the brown soil. She crouched and looked more closely. Grass seedlings, not planted, not broadcast, naturally germinating from the seed bank that had been locked in the soil beneath years of invasive canopy, waiting, as seeds do, for the right combination of light and temperature to break their dormancy. The goats had not brought the grass. The grass had always been there. The goats had simply removed what was preventing it from reaching the light. Louise called Marcus that evening. She asked him to come and look at the upper paddock. He came the following weekend. He crouched in the light patch and looked at the seedlings and did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you know what species that is?" She did. It was big bluestem, Andropogon gerardii, a native warm-season grass that had been part of the original plant community on this land before it was broken and overgrazed into the ground. It had sat in the seed bank for years, possibly decades, waiting for exactly this moment. Marcus looked up at her. He said, "How many of these patches are you seeing?" She showed him 11 more across the upper paddock alone. He stood up slowly. He did not say anything for quite a long time. Then he said, "Miss Bright, I need you to know that what you're describing is not supposed to happen this fast." She said, "How fast is it supposed to happen?" He said, "On land this degraded, most restoration projects budget 3 to 5 years before you see native seed bank activation." She was 8 months in. The months that followed were not a straight line upward. They never are on damaged land. The summer of 2015 was dry. Not catastrophically, but enough to slow the grass establishment on the sections that had been most recently cleared by the goats. Louise lost 2 does to a respiratory illness that moved through the herd in August. A reminder that even a well-managed goat operation carries real biological risk. She spent 3 weeks in late summer retensioning the polywire paddock dividers after a branch fall in a summer storm took out 60 feet of fence and let the entire herd into the lowest paddock a month ahead of schedule. These were not catastrophes, but they were setbacks, real ones. The kind that remind you that farming is not a series of insights and discoveries. It is a long series of problems being managed by a person who is paying close attention. By the autumn of 2015, 1 full year in, Louise had something she could point to. Not pasture, not yet, but a visible, measurable, undeniable reduction in the autumn olive coverage on the upper 40 acres. She estimated, and Marcus confirmed with a rough aerial comparison using drone photography, that the invasive canopy coverage had been reduced by approximately 30% in the upper paddocks and 20% in the midsection. The light reaching the soil surface had increased proportionally. The native seed bank activations were now visible in nearly every area the goats had cleared and rested. Big bluestem, Indian grass, switchgrass, wild bergamot, yellow coneflower. Plants that had not been visible on this property in living memory were beginning to appear in the light patches left by 32 goats working through the brush one season at a time. Dale Puckett noticed in the late autumn of 2015. He was driving his truck along the county road past the south fence line of Louise's property when he slowed down and looked across at the upper field. Then he stopped the truck. He got out. He stood at the fence for a while, looking at something he had been looking at the wrong version of for his entire life. He had looked at this land as a failure, as something used up and discarded, as evidence of what happened when you asked too much of a piece of ground. What he was looking at now was not yet pasture. It was not yet recovered, but it was different. The green wall of autumn olive that had made the upper field invisible from the road for 15 years was thinner. More light came through, and in the light, where the goats had cleared and the grass had followed, the soil was no longer bare and eroding. Something was holding it. He drove to Louise's house that evening. He knocked on the door. When she answered, he said, "I want to come and look at what's happening up there, if you'll allow me." She allowed him. He walked the upper paddocks with her the following morning. He said very little. He asked practical questions about the paddock rotation schedule, about the herd size, about what she was doing for mineral supplementation, about whether she had treated the worst erosion channels. Professional questions, farmer questions. At the end of the walk, standing at the highest point of the upper field, where the rock shelf emerged from the thin soil and the cedar canopy had been heaviest before the goats arrived, Dale Puckett looked out across what was beginning to become, in patches and in progress, something that resembled a future. And he said, "I watched my father destroy this land over 30 years. I thought it was gone." Louise said, "The seed bank was intact. The rock is structurally sound. Everything the land needed to come back was already here." He looked at her. She said, "It just needed someone to stop asking the wrong thing of it." By the spring of 2017, 2.5 years from the day Louise had paid $8,500 for 90 acres of nothing, the County Agricultural Extension Office received an unusual request. A soil scientist from the University of Kentucky asked permission to conduct a formal study of the Bright property in Harlan County. He had heard about it from Marcus, who had mentioned it to a colleague, who had mentioned it at a conference. The scientist, a man named Dr. Robert Chen, who had spent his career studying degraded land restoration in Appalachia, spent 4 days on the property in June of 2017. He took soil cores across 22 sample points. He measured organic matter content. He measured compaction. He measured water infiltration rates. He counted plant species. He counted invertebrate populations. He photographed everything. His preliminary findings, published in an Agricultural University Extension Bulletin the following winter, described the Bright property as one of the most significant examples of passive-assisted land restoration he had encountered in 15 years of field research in the eastern United States. In the baseline sample areas where Louise had started, the most degraded, most rock-dense, most invasive-covered sections of the upper 40 acres, organic matter content had risen from under 2% to 4.1. Water infiltration had improved by a factor of 3, meaning that rainfall that had previously run off the surface was now soaking into the soil. He had counted 37 native plant species on the property, compared to a presumed near zero at the time of purchase. And the autumn olive coverage, the invasive species that had seemed permanent, intractable, impossible to remove without machinery that couldn't access the terrain, had been reduced from near total canopy coverage to isolated clumps across the upper paddocks. None of it had required a tractor. None of it had required herbicide. None of it had required any input that Louise could not personally manage on a retired teacher's budget. It had required 32 goats, a rotational paddock system, patience measured in seasons, not weeks, and a woman who had spent 27 years teaching biology and had understood, better than most, that the land was not broken. It was merely waiting. The county took notice in the spring of 2018. The same agricultural board that had declined to assist in her first year invited Louise to speak at their annual farm management conference. She spoke for 40 minutes. She brought photographs. She brought Dr. Chen's data. She brought Marcus, who sat in the front row and watched the room the way someone watches a reaction they have been waiting a long time to see. At the end of her presentation, A farmer in the back row, a man who had farmed Harlan County for 40 years and had attended every one of these conferences without ever once been surprised by anything he heard, raised his hand and asked, "What do you do with the goats once the land is recovered?" Louise looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled. She said, "You sell them at a premium because boar-cross meat goats have one of the strongest demand curves in small-scale livestock right now. And then you start again with cattle on the recovered pasture you just built for $8,500. The room was quiet for a moment. Then somebody started clapping. By 2019, 5 years after the auction where the county clerk had written down Louise Bright's winning bid with the quiet skepticism of someone who had seen this property fail before, the lower 30 acres of the Bright property were carrying a rotation of beef cattle on recovered pasture, native warm-season grasses, managed rotationally, rested properly, the way the land had never been managed by any of its previous owners. The upper 60 acres were still in active goat management. The rock density and the terrain made cattle difficult up there, but the transformation was visible from the county road in a way that made people slow down. Dale Puckett had planted 2 acres of multiflora rose on his property, deliberately as a windbreak experiment. He had watched Louise's goats demonstrate that multiflora rose was not a permanent problem. He borrowed 4 of her does for a season to address it. It worked. He told 2 other farmers. They borrowed goats. By the time 2020 arrived, there were 7 properties in Harlan County using some form of the rotational goat browsing method that Louise had practiced on land the county had tried to sell for 11 years. None of them had bought anything close to Louise's situation. But all of them had land that conventional wisdom had written off in some way. Brushy fence lines, cedar-invaded hillsides, eroded creek banks, and all of them were watching the same thing happen that Louise had watched in that upper paddock in March of 2015. Light reaching the soil. Seeds finding the light. Life finding the seeds. There is a version of this story that explains itself as exceptional. A unique woman. A unique piece of land. A specific set of circumstances that happened to align in a way that produced an extraordinary result. That version is wrong. Louise Bright was not exceptional in any way that made her different from thousands of other people who have looked at damaged land and decided it was finished. What she did differently was to ask a different question of it. Not what is wrong with this land, but what does this land still have? The answer, in 2014, was 90 acres of sound bedrock, a functioning seed bank, autumn olive that could feed goats, a woman who had spent a career understanding how living systems recover. That was enough. It was more than enough. The lesson of Louise Bright's 90 acres is not about goats. It is not about regenerative agriculture. It is not even about the extraordinary patience required to watch seasons pass on land that isn't doing what you need it to do yet. The lesson is about the question. Ask what a broken thing still has, before you decide it has nothing left. The county tried to sell those 90 acres for 11 years because they were asking what was wrong with them. Louise Bright bought them in 11 minutes because she already knew what was right. If Louise's story made you look at a piece of land, or anything else, differently today, we're glad this found you. Subscribe to the Rural Files for stories every week from the farms, valleys, and counties where the real work of the land gets done. Leave your state or country in the comments. We read every single one.